Working the late shift can be a very strange experience. When the rest of the world is fast asleep, the people who keep things running in the dark see a completely different side of humanity. Sometimes it is just quiet and lonely, but other times, the silence of the night is broken by things that defy explanation. Things that can turn a normal, boring job into an absolute nightmare. Our first story starts with a 24-year-old guy named Thomas Hurley. Thomas had recently graduated from college, but like many young people starting out, he had a hard time finding a professional career right away. To make ends meet and pay his rent, he took a job working the late shift at a local Burger King. It was not a glamorous job, but Thomas was a natural night owl, so the hours actually worked well for him. His shift ran from 10 o'clock at night until 4 o'clock in the morning, and after midnight, he was almost always working the drive-through lane completely by himself. The job was incredibly repetitive and usually very boring, but about a month ago, something happened that broke the monotony in the strangest way possible. Thomas was sitting inside the booth, listening to the hum of the kitchen equipment, when he heard the familiar beep of his headset. A car had pulled up to the speaker box outside. Thomas greeted the customer, and a completely unremarkable male voice placed an order. The man wanted a large double Whopper with cheese meal with a Coca-Cola. It was one of the most common items on the menu, so Thomas put it through, packaged the food, and waited at the window. When the car pulled up, Thomas noticed that the windows were heavily tinted. The driver did not roll his window down all the way. Instead, he just cracked it open a tiny bit, just barely enough to slide his credit card through the gap. Thomas could not see the driver's face at all. He took the card, swiped it through the reader, handed it back along with the receipt, and then turned around to grab the bag of food. But by the time Thomas turned back to the window to hand the customer his meal, the car was already speeding away. Thomas stood there holding the hot bag of food, completely confused. He figured the driver had just made a mistake, or was in an extreme rush, and forgot why he had stopped in the first place. He waited at the window for several minutes, fully expecting the car to circle back around the building to claim the food. But the car never returned. Since the food was already paid for and would otherwise go to waste, Thomas ended up eating the double Whopper meal himself later in the shift. He laughed it off, thinking people just do weird things sometimes. But about a week later, Thomas was working the same solo late shift when he heard that same beep in his headset. A voice came through the speaker, and it was the exact same unremarkable male voice. The customer ordered the exact same thing, a large double Whopper with cheese meal with a Coke. Thomas prepared the order, and when the car pulled up, it was the exact same dark vehicle with heavily tinted windows. Once again, the driver only cracked the window a tiny fraction of an inch to slide his card through. Thomas swiped the card, handed it back, and when he turned around with the bag of food, the car was already gone. At this point, Thomas was genuinely puzzled. He remembered the encounter from the week before and realized this could not be a simple mistake. No one accidentally buys a full meal twice, pays for it, and then drives away without the food. But since there was no harm done, and he was getting a free dinner out of it, Thomas did not complain. Over the next few weeks, this bizarre ritual continued. Every 4 or 5 days, always between 1 and 3 in the morning, this mysterious customer would show up, order the exact same meal, pay through a tiny crack in the tinted window, and immediately speed off into the night. Thomas actually started to look forward to these visits, jokingly referring to the driver as his mysterious benefactor. But one night, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, the routine took a dark turn. The beep sounded in Thomas's headset, and the familiar voice placed the order for the double Whopper meal. But this time, after Thomas entered the order, the driver did not stay silent. He paused for a moment, and then he said, in a very calm and deliberate voice, "I hope you have been enjoying those Whoppers, Mr. Hurley." Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine. He froze in place. He was not wearing a name tag with his last name on it. His last name, Hurley, was not posted anywhere on the windows, the menu, or the receipt. There was absolutely no logical way for this stranger to know who he was. Thomas tried to speak into his headset, asking who the man was and how he knew his name, but there was no response. This time, the driver did not even pull up to the window to pay. Thomas heard the loud roar of the car's engine as it accelerated and sped away into the darkness. Thomas was deeply rattled for the rest of his shift, but things were about to get much worse. When he finally finished his work and drove home in the early morning hours, he walked up to his front door and stopped dead in his tracks. Sitting on his doorstep was a handwritten note. He picked it up with shaking hands and read the words. It said, "I know what you did. You have 3 days." Thomas felt physically sick. He sat on his couch with all the lights on, racking his brain to figure out what he could have possibly done to anger someone. He was just a 24-year-old guy who worked at a fast food joint and spent his free time playing video games. He did not have any enemies. He did not have any major secrets. And he had never done anything to warrant this kind of harassment. He did not sleep a single wink that night. The next night, Thomas was back at work, terrified of what might happen. Sure enough, the man returned, but this time he did not bother ordering food. He drove up to the speaker box and told Thomas to write down an address on the outskirts of town, in an isolated area Thomas did not recognize. The voice then told him he had exactly 2 days to deliver $10,000 to that location. Thomas was stunned. He did not have $10,000, and even if he did, he was not going to give it to a stalker. He decided to ignore the demand, hoping it was just an elaborate, cruel prank. But 3 nights later, the threat became physical. Thomas was sitting in his living room, trying to unwind after a shift, when a sudden explosive crash shattered the silence. A large rock had been hurled through his front window, sending glass spraying across the room. Thomas dove to the floor, terrified that he was being shot at. When he finally built up the courage to look outside, the street was completely empty. This time, Thomas called the police. He gave them the details of the extortion, the address he had been told to go to, and the history of the drive-through transactions. The police took a report and promised to patrol his neighborhood a bit more closely. But they admitted there was very little they could do without security footage of the suspect's face or license plate. Thomas has spent the last 3 days calling in sick to work, too terrified to leave his home, knowing that this unknown person knows exactly where he lives and is still out there. His only hope now is that the police can somehow track down the suspect using the credit card records from the drive-through orders. Our second story involves another young graduate who had to turn to the gig economy to survive. After graduating with a degree in communications, this young man found himself in the same position as Thomas, unable to secure a traditional office job. To make some money, he started driving for Uber and Uber Eats. He worked mostly on Friday and Saturday nights, starting around 9 in the evening and driving until 3 in the morning, which was when the bars closed and downtown was flooded with people needing a ride home. On a Saturday night at around 1:30 in the morning, he was exhausted and ready to call it a night. He was just about to log off the app when a final ride request flashed on his phone screen. The pickup was downtown, but the drop-off destination was incredibly far away, well past the outer suburbs and into a very rural, isolated area. He almost declined the ride because he did not want to drive that far, but the surge pricing made the fare too good to pass up. He picked up the passenger, a young woman who behaved completely normally, and drove 40 minutes out into the countryside. After he dropped her off at her destination, he was left completely alone in the pitch black. The GPS showed that he had a long 40-minute journey ahead of him just to get back to the highway. He turned his car around and began the lonely drive home on the dark, empty country roads. About 10 minutes into his drive, he saw hazard lights flashing in the distance. As he got closer, he saw a car stop dead in the middle of the 2-lane road. Standing in front of the car were 2 people, waving their arms frantically to flag him down. His immediate instinct was to drive right past them, as stopping on a deserted road in the middle of the night is incredibly risky. But he was a helpful person by nature, and he felt a pang of guilt at the thought of leaving people stranded. He slowed his car down, stopping about 20 feet away from their vehicle, and kept his engine running. He rolled his driver's side window down just a few inches, enough to hear them, but keeping the door locked and the window high enough to prevent anyone from reaching inside. The 2 people were a middle-aged couple, which made him feel slightly safer. But the moment the woman started speaking, His anxiety returned. The woman spoke with a frantic, intense energy. She told him that the bridge just ahead had collapsed into the river earlier that day, and that she and her husband had almost driven right off the edge themselves. She pointed down the road into the dark and warned him that if he kept going, his car would plunge into the water. The husband then spoke up, advising him to take a narrow dirt turnoff that was located about a mile back. He claimed that this path cut through the woods and would bypass the collapsed bridge, bringing him safely back to the main highway. The driver thanked them, put his car in reverse, and backed up to find the turnoff. But as he drove, his intuition kicked in. Something about the woman's speech felt rehearsed, as if she had practiced the warning multiple times. When he reached the dirt turnoff, he stopped. The path was incredibly narrow, barely wide enough for a single car, and was completely engulfed by thick, dark trees. It looked like a trap. He decided to trust his gut. Instead of turning down the dark dirt road, he decided to drive straight ahead and see the bridge for himself. If it was truly collapsed, he would simply turn around. He drove past the turnoff and continued down the main road. A few minutes later, he reached the bridge. To his shock, the bridge was completely intact. There were no barriers, no warning signs, no police, and no damage whatsoever. He drove across it easily and made it back to the highway safely. The couple had lied to him. A few days later, the driver could not stop thinking about what had happened. He decided to drive back to that rural road in broad daylight to see the area clearly. He retraced his route, and when he reached the narrow dirt turnoff, he pulled his car over. To his surprise, there was a brand new wooden sign nailed to a tree at the entrance of the path that simply said, "Dead End." He was positive that sign had not been there the night he was flagged down. He decided to get out of his car and explore the path on foot. The sun was shining, and he felt safe enough to investigate. But the moment he stepped onto the dirt path, the atmosphere shifted. The woods were dead silent, and an overwhelming feeling of danger washed over him. He realized he was making a mistake. He turned around to walk back to his car, and at that exact moment, a terrifying, blood-curdling scream of a woman echoed from deep within the trees down the path. The driver did not wait to investigate. He bolted to his car, locked the doors, and sped away as fast as he could. He has never gone back to that road, but he is haunted by the realization of what might have happened to him if he had trusted that strange couple and driven down that dark, isolated dirt path in the middle of the night. Our third story takes us back a few years, when a 26-year-old man was working as an overnight security guard for a large commercial warehouse complex. The complex was located in an industrial park on the edge of a small, quiet city. His shift was from 11 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock in the morning, and he was the only living soul on the entire property during those hours. Most of his nights were entirely uneventful. He would clock in, do an initial walk of the perimeter, and then spend the rest of his night in the small security office, watching the camera feeds and doing hourly patrols. The warehouse stored heavy industrial equipment and bulk supplies, so there was nothing of extreme value inside that would typically attract thieves. On this particular night, a light snow was falling, coating the empty industrial park in a quiet blanket of white. At around 1:30 in the morning, the security guard received a motion alert on the monitor for the loading dock camera. This was not entirely unusual, as the cameras were highly sensitive and could be triggered by blowing snow or wild animals. He pulled up the live feed, but the dock looked completely empty. However, the alerts kept coming. Every 10 to 15 minutes, the exact same camera would trigger. Each time he checked, the dock appeared vacant, but he began to notice that the movement seemed to occur right at the very edge of the camera's frame, as if someone was deliberately standing just out of sight, testing the sensor's range. By 3 in the morning, after receiving nearly a dozen alerts, he decided he had to check it out in person. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and stepped out into the freezing, silent night. He walked the entire perimeter of the loading dock, shining his light into the dark corners. There was nothing there. The bay doors were all securely locked, and there were no footprints in the fresh snow other than his own. He went back inside, trying to convince himself it was just a glitch. But 20 minutes after returning to the warmth of the office, A loud, metallic scraping sound echoed through the silent building. It sounded like a heavy piece of machinery was being dragged slowly across the concrete floor, deep inside the warehouse. He checked the interior camera feeds, but all the aisles looked empty under the dim night lights. An hour later, the sound returned, much louder this time, followed by a sudden, heavy bang against one of the interior doors. The guard immediately cycled through the camera feeds again. When he reached camera 6, the screen showed nothing but static for 3 seconds, and then the picture returned. But the camera's angle had changed. It had been shifted slightly to the left, as if someone had physically bumped into the camera housing. He knew he had to investigate. He grabbed his radio, gripped his flashlight, and unlocked the heavy door leading into the main warehouse. The interior was massive, 80,000 square feet of towering shelves filled with crates. The lights were dimmed to save energy, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. He walked slowly down the main aisle, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, he heard the distinct sound of footsteps. They were coming from the aisles to his left. Matching his pace, he stopped walking. The footsteps stopped. He stood in the absolute silence, his heart hammering in his chest, waiting for any sound. He decided to break the tension. He called out in his loudest, most authoritative security voice, demanding that whoever was in the warehouse reveal themselves. His voice echoed off the high steel ceiling, but there was no reply. He completed the rest of his patrol in a state of absolute panic, but he found no one. The next morning, his supervisor and the maintenance team conducted a thorough search of the building. They found no broken locks, no open doors, and no sign of an intruder. The supervisor clearly did not believe his story, but the guard knew what he had heard. He was absolutely certain that someone had been in the warehouse with him, hiding in the dark shadows just out of reach of his flashlight. Our final story comes from a young man who took his first job at a 24-hour gym during a gap year between high school and college. Because he was young and did not have many commitments, he was frequently assigned the overnight shifts, working from 8 o'clock in the evening until 6 o'clock in the morning. The gym was located in a rough part of town, but it was generally a very quiet place at night. Members could only access the facility by scanning their key cards at the front door, so there were rarely many people inside after midnight. Most of the night, the gym was practically empty, and the young employee spent his time cleaning the machines, doing paperwork, and watching the security monitors from the front desk office. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning when he finished his cleaning duties and sat down in the office to monitor the cameras. Most of the regular night members had already left, leaving the gym nearly empty. But as he scanned the monitors, he noticed a man using a treadmill in the far corner of the cardio room. He had never seen this man before. The gym's computer system allowed the staff to monitor the live activity of each machine. He pulled up the data for that specific treadmill and saw that the man was running at 9 miles per hour. This was a very fast, intense sprint, but what was truly bizarre was that the man did not stop. 10 minutes went by, then 15, and the man maintained the exact same grueling pace without slowing down once. Intrigued and slightly unsettled, the employee zoomed in the security camera on the runner's face. The man had long, messy, unwashed hair and was wearing ragged, dirty clothes, but his face was completely motionless. His eyes were locked in a vacant, intense stare straight ahead, and his mouth was hanging wide open. Then, the employee looked down at the man's feet. He was not wearing shoes. He was sprinting at 9 miles per hour, completely barefoot on the rough belt of the treadmill. The gym had a strict policy requiring athletic shoes for safety reasons, so the employee decided to use this rule as an excuse to confront the man and tell him to leave. He got up from his desk, walked out of the secure office, and headed down the hallway toward the cardio room. As soon as he turned the corner and saw the treadmill in person, his breath caught in his throat. The entire conveyor belt of the treadmill was covered in blood. The man's bare feet were literally tearing apart against the moving belt, spraying blood and skin with every single stride he took. Yet the man's expression did not change. He did not show any signs of pain. He simply continued to sprint, staring blankly ahead with his mouth wide open. Terrified, the employee stood back and yelled over the noise of the machine, telling the man that he needed to stop the treadmill immediately. The man did not turn his head or acknowledge him. He just kept running. The employee yelled again, louder this time, asking him what he was doing. The man finally spoke, but he did not look at the employee. In a cold, raspy, hollow voice that did not sound human, he muttered, "Are you there?" The employee, trembling with fear, told him again to stop the machine. The man simply repeated the phrase, "Are you there?" over and over, his voice devoid of any exhaustion despite his intense physical exertion. The pool of blood at the back of the treadmill was growing larger by the second. Deciding that this man was undergoing a severe mental health crisis, or was under the influence of dangerous drugs, the employee turned around and ran back to the secure security office to call the police. He locked himself inside and glanced at the monitors. The man on the treadmill had stopped running. He was now standing on the bloody machine, staring directly into the security camera lens. He was looking straight at the employee through the screen. Suddenly, the man began to scream at the top of his lungs, his face contorted in a terrifying expression of pure rage. The man then jumped off the treadmill and ran out of the camera's view. The employee frantically clicked through the different camera feeds, trying to find where the man had gone, but he was nowhere to be seen. There was only one camera left to check, the camera monitoring the private employee hallway leading directly to the office door. The employee clicked the feed and his heart stopped. The barefoot, bleeding man was standing in the dark hallway, just 6 feet away from the office door. A second later, the heavy door handle began to rattle violently as the man tried to force his way inside. He began to scream again, a deep, guttural, terrifying sound that echoed through the thin walls of the office. The employee hid in the corner, clutching his phone, desperately begging the police dispatcher to hurry. The screaming and the shaking of the door continued for 3 agonizing minutes, and the employee was convinced that if the man broke through, he would not survive the night. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. When the police arrived 5 minutes later, they searched the entire gym, but the man was gone. He had vanished into the night, leaving behind only a trail of bloody footprints leading out the exit. The employee quit his job the very next day and has never set foot in that gym again. These stories show us that the night shift holds dangers that most people never have to face. Whether it is a stalker at a drive-thru, a mysterious trap on a lonely country road, an intruder in a dark warehouse, or a terrifying encounter in an empty gym, the dark hours can turn the most ordinary jobs into fights for survival. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.